Good evening, everyone. It's great to see old friends. It's so nice. I really did not enjoy just speaking into the void. Welcome to the World Affairs Forum Speaker Series. On behalf of the Board of Directors, I want to welcome each of you to our event this evening. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Wendy Scratt. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Forum. If you don't know much about the Forum, it is a Connecticut-based nonprofit organization whose work is to provide its members with access to a diverse group of global leaders, policy experts, and leading journalists who directly share their insights on important global issues and strategic U.S. relationships around the globe. As always, I want to thank our sponsors, Genry Corp, McCarter & English, First County Bank, Alliance Bernstein, Stanford Health, and back with us just as today, the Prince Law Group. Their support absolutely makes our work possible. I want to thank each of you that are attending tonight. In response to the pandemic, as you know, we moved to all virtual programming, and this is the first of our virtual programming which required membership or a ticket purchase. This change is critical to our ability to keep the organization going, and I'm making notes and I know who's supporting it, and I can't thank you enough. Obviously, we have moved to the Zoom meeting format away from webinar. The mission of the forum is to connect our community through conversations about global issues, so this move aligns us with our mission. We will be recording and are recording this event as usual, and it will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you'd prefer not to share your video, you should turn that off now with the controls at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will open the conversation for Q&A in the second half of the program. We are asking that you still submit your questions for the speaker in the chat. Behind the scenes, we have Frank Bria as our question manager who will be sorting and compiling questions and then calling on you to pose your question for Professor Hathaway yourself. In the meantime, if everyone could please mute themselves, which you already have, that will allow us to focus on Professor Hathaway's presentation. We encourage you to submit your questions in the chat while she's presenting so that we can efficiently get through as many as possible once we move to the Q&A. And I thank each of you in advance for bearing with us while we try out this new process. Hopefully it's not bumpy. We're experimenting with how best to reintegrate as much opportunity as possible for each of you to contribute to the conversation and seeing each other while we're doing it. With that, I will pass the mic to our forum board member and new program co-chair, Thomas Krantz, who will be introducing Professor Hathaway. Once we move to the Q&A, we'll pass it to board member and program co-chair, Frank Bria, who will be managing the Q&A.
Thank you, Wendy. So far, so good. The theme tonight is international law as a policy tool. And I'd like to reflect as to why we wanted to start with law as our first event of the year. When we contacted Professor Hathaway, we were thinking about Brexit. The Prime Minister of the UK was contemplating annulling an international treaty. We had questions about the Iran nuclear deal, the World Health Organization membership. In fact, what is the legal framework of our international order? Is there anything we can count on? To what extent can we count on it? And how does it come about? Those were the questions that we used when we approached Professor Hathaway. I'd like to take a moment to go over her current tasks, which are multiple, and forgive me about taking a moment, but to grasp the breadth and depth of her work, it's worth spending a moment. She is the Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. She's also Professor of International Law and Area Studies at Yale, Professor in the Department of Political Science, and the Director of the Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges. She's been a member of the Advisory Committee on International Law at the State Department since 2005. In 2014 and 2015, she took leave to serve the Secretary of Defense as one of their counselors in the Pentagon. She after graduating from Yale Law School, she clerked for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And how do we frame all of these questions? When we spoke with her, we decided to begin with how today's legal framework came to be, more or less, as we know it and is familiar. We're going to start with her book published with Scott Shapiro in 2017 called The Internationalists, how a radical plan to outlaw war remade the world in the 1920s. With that, over to you, Professor Hathaway, and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I will say it is awfully nice to be able to see all of your faces. I give a lot of these webinars, and sometimes when you're speaking, you don't know who, you can't see people respond or react to what you're talking about. And so I do like this format. I can actually see you all and see if you're falling asleep. That lets me know that I need to jazz it up or move along. And hopefully see if what I'm speaking about is making any sense. So I appreciate that, and I'll look forward to our conversation at the end. So let me share my slides with you all, and hopefully you will be able to see this. So my plan, as was said, is to talk about international agreements as political tools, past, present, and future. And I'm going to try to go back a little bit in history to kind of give us a sense of what the world order used to look like, how it transitioned, what that led to today, and what can we expect going forward, with a focus on international agreements, but trying to embed international agreements in kind of the bigger picture of what the global legal order looks like. And hopefully it'll become clear why I'm doing it that way. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to talk about the old world order, sort of what did the world used to look like? How did it transform? How did that give rise to something I call the new world order, and kind of what's next, for lack of a better phrase. So old world order. Many of you have probably heard of Hugo Grotius, the father of international law. He got his start. You may have heard of him, but if you have, you may not know that he got his start as a corporate lawyer for the Dutch East India Company. And he was hired to write a pamphlet for the Dutch East India Company to defend its seizure of a ship, a Portuguese ship in the East Indies. And he sat down to write this pamphlet, and like someone who had become a good academic, instead of writing a short pamphlet, he wrote hundreds of pages. It took him way too long, and it was completely useless to the company at the end. But in the process, he basically reinvented international law. And he wrote a set of rules that became the foundation of international law that now lead us to still look back at him as a father of international law. And very few people actually read what he wrote. If you read what he wrote, it's really striking. So he says war is a permissible remedy for wrongdoing. His theory of international law really centers around the role of war in the international order. So he says when judicial settlement ends, war begins. So what's he mean by that? What he means is you can go to war for things that if you don't have access to a court, you could have gone to court, for. So, but if you're in a situation where you don't have access to a court, say you're a Dutch trader who has been trying to buy spices in the East Indies and the Portuguese keep getting in the way. Instead of going to court, because you don't have access to a court, you can just go seize that Portuguese ship, tow it back to the Netherlands, sell it off for millions of guilders, and keep the money. And so he develops this whole theory of international law grounded in the right to use war. Now you might wonder, did states actually do this? Like this sounds like a crazy thing, like that they would use war in this way, that they would actually use war to enforce their rights. And so to find out if any state actually followed these rules, one thing that my co-author and I did with a team of students was we went out and found all these documents, which are called war manifestos. So for hundreds of years, when states would go to war with each other, they would issue these manifestos and they would say, here's why we're going to war. You stole my wife, or you owe me money, or you're interfering with religious practices of my religious confederates, or you're interfering with my inheritance claims, or you're interfering with my trade relations. One thing that is interesting is that among the most common reasons, and I circled them here, were violations of treaty obligations. And they would often reference law of war, law of nations, or customary international law. In fact, in about half of manifestos, they would reference the fact that the other side had broken a treaty obligation. So I'm going to get to this in a moment, but when my students ask me, well, what happens if you break a treaty? There's nothing that happens. Well, it used to be the case that the answer was you could be suffering an attack of war for failing to abide by your treaty obligations. That's not true today. We're going to get to that. But that used to be the case. It used to be the case that that was a key remedy for violating international treaty obligations, was that the other side might very well go to war against you for it. So the point I want to make is that in what we call in the book, the Old World Order, the privilege to use force, the right to go to war, was a kind of central legal principle. It was not just a breakdown of law, it was the foundation of law. And that privilege to use force to enforce your legal rights, including treaty rights, including international law rights, was the foundation for all the rest of the legal principles in the system. And so I want to say just a few words about what that looked like, because when we see it, we can see how different that world looks, and it helps us, I think, better understand the kind of unique features of the world that we live in today. So let me say just a few words about each of these boxes and why I think they matter. So if war is legal, as it was for hundreds of years, then conquest is legal. So one of the stories that we tell is the seizure of much of what is now the United States from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, which ended with the cession of a huge amount of land in 1848. And the legal cause of that war, the legal justification that was given by this lovely man here, President Polk, who looks very cheery, was that the United States was owed a significant amount of money by the Mexican government. So the Mexican government had 32 governments in 31 years. It had failed to pay significant debts to the Americans. There was actually an arbitral panel where they found that they owed over $20 million to the United States. The US agreed to a payment plan from the Mexicans, and then they just failed to, they did the first payment and then they defaulted. And so Polk demanded a trade of land. They wouldn't even receive his diplomats, and then launched a war against Mexico and seized all this land in payment of the debt and the cost of collection. That is the war itself. That was the cost of collection. And then because they took a little more land than they were entitled to, they paid the Mexicans a little bit of additional money in the treaty settlement at the end of the war. So if war is legal, then conquest is legal. If war is legal, gunboat diplomacy is legal. One of the stories that we tell is a story of the seizure, of the arrival of the US in Japan. This guy is Commodore Perry. He arrives on these steamships, which this is a woodcut rendering of what that looked like from the Japanese perspective. Because they had been closed off from trade for hundreds of years to that point, they hadn't seen steamships. And so when he shows up with his steamships in Edo Bay, which is now Tokyo Bay, it was really terrifying. And he insisted that Japan enter into a treaty of friendship with the United States, or else we would go to war with them, or else we would come in and conquer them. And that treaty was signed eventually. And not only was that treaty considered perfectly valid and legal, but it was also considered then legally enforceable. So if Japan were to violate it, well, now you've got a cause of war, a legitimate cause of war for which you can go to war against them. So under this system, if war is legal, gunboat diplomacy is perfectly legal. If war is legal, there can't be a crime of aggression. So after World War I, some of the allies wanted to try the Kaiser for launching this war and getting the entire world involved in this terrible war. And the Dutch, of all people, wouldn't turn him over because they said, look, there's nothing illegal about what he did. There's nothing criminal about what he did. Yeah, it's terrible. Yes, we hate him too, but there was nothing illegal about launching an aggressive war. An aggressive war was perfectly legal at the time. So the Dutch, now the home of all these international criminal courts, refused to turn him over. And the Americans kind of said, they're right. We can't really turn him over because there's nothing criminal about what he did. And if war is legal, then states are not allowed to favor either side. Neutrals, to be neutral, have to be completely neutral. No economic sanctions against one side, even if you think they've behaved illegally. No better trade relations with one side, no favoritism of any kind. If you break that rule, then you're violating neutrality and, again, giving a cause of war. So Wilson, while he was still managing to keep us out of war, so before the US entered, called on Americans to be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. So he was calling on Americans to do all that they could to observe this requirement of neutrality. Okay, so the old world order places privileged use force in the middle, and then all the rest of these rules necessarily followed from it. Obviously, you're thinking, well, that's not what the world looks like today. So when and how did that change? So the next part of this is the transformation. I'm not going to give the full detail of it, but I'm going to give you the sort of bits and pieces of it. So one of the key moments is the Calibri Impact of 1928. Now, if you've heard of the Calibri Impact of 1928, you may be thinking like, I've heard of that. And it's sort of the example of a folly of international law. When it's taught as like, what an absurdity, completely ridiculous effort by international lawyers to outlaw war between the two major world wars. Like, how outrageous is that? Clearly it was a complete failure. We try in the book to resuscitate it a bit and to say, obviously it didn't work in the ways that it was hoped, but it was a beginning of a transformation that turned out to actually be quite important. It was at the time the most ratified treaty in the world. It was the first time that states had agreed together to say, look, we're not going to use war as a tool of national policy any longer. We're not going to use war to enforce our legal rights. This is the signing ceremony that was held in Paris. It was a hugely celebrated event. 15 states showed up in Paris for the signing ceremony, and then the treaty traveled the world and was signed by nearly every country in the world. It was considered a huge event and a really important turning point in the international legal order. Now, of course, not that long after the signing ceremony happened, war began to break out. And the problem is that they hadn't really thought through what happens next. So one of the big problems was they had this idea of declaring war is no longer legal, but if the way that you've enforced international law for hundreds of years is with war, and now you've said that war is illegal, how do you enforce international law in a world where you can't use war? And so they ran into this problem. And what they no longer had access to privileged use force at its core, what would they use instead? And what they had to do was flip it on its head, turn a prohibition to use force to replace the prohibition on force, but then all the rest of the rules had to change too. So the first event was Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. And the world was really struck because they didn't really know how to respond. Japan had actually ratified the Calibri Impact. They were at the signing ceremony in Paris, one of the 15 nations invited to this very fancy signing ceremony. China had also signed the pact, so they were both parties to it. And here Japan is invading Manchuria in 1931 with a very thinly veiled excuse for that. They claimed that Chinese brigands had set a charge on the Japanese-run South Manchuria Railway, but it turns out later it was actually young Japanese troops trying to create an excuse for going to war that actually set that charge. But even if it had been Chinese brigands, it destroyed 18 inches of the Japanese-run South Manchuria Railway. So not a particularly good justification for taking over all of Manchuria. So the question was, what do we do about this? And they were really flummoxed, frankly. They didn't know how to respond. Until Stimson came up with an idea, Henry Stimson came up with an idea, which is, well, what we can do is we can refuse to recognize it. That might be something. Instead of recognizing that it has become part of Japan, or that this puppet government that they tried to set up is a legitimate government, we can just refuse to recognize this conquest of land. And so he issues this note on behalf of the US that says, we're not going to recognize this change that's brought about by means contrary to the Pact of Paris, which is another name for the Calibri Impact. And then the League of Nations very quickly followed suit, refused to recognize that conquest. And so where there had been a right of conquest, now there's no right of conquest. And that's an important shift in international law that pretty quickly comes after the Calibri Impact. And that actually has made a real difference in the world. So in the old world order, about 200,000 square kilometers changed hands every year as a result of wars. In the new world order, in the modern era, that that is not completely disappeared, but has fallen significantly. It's on average 15,000 square kilometers per year. So much less than used to be the common case. So there seems to be a significant change in kind of the real world, not just theory, but actual practice in the world. Stimson also said, we're not going to recognize a treaty or agreement either. So this is a real rejection of gunboat diplomacy. So even if you can get China to agree to these changes, we're not going to accept them. We're not going to accept a treaty that's brought about at the point of a gun. That's coerced. That's no longer acceptable. And that then becomes part of the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, which incorporates this prohibition on agreements brought about by duress. So it says a treaty is void if conclusion has been procured by threat or use of force. Now, from modern perspective, that doesn't seem like a very big deal. But if you look at it historically, it's a huge deal because treaties up to that point, most of them were a result of force, or a significant number of them were a result of force. And so that becomes an important change. Where there had been gunboat diplomacy, now it's prohibited. Now, neutrality. Attorney General Robert Jackson, at the time Attorney General, became the prosecutor at Nuremberg and then became Justice of the US Supreme Court, was confronted with this question as to whether lend-lease might be legal. So it was a proposed program. He had to decide, is that legal? Can we provide these goods to Britain if we're not offering the same to Germany? And this is, again, before the US has entered into the war. If we do that, are we effectively violating neutrality and giving a cause of war? And he says, no, the Treaty for Annunciation of War, yet another name for the Calibri Impact, has changed the nature of war in international law. And by doing so, it's changed the nature of neutrality. That allows the US to enter into the Lend-Lease agreement that becomes crucial to shoring up the British in the war. So where neutrality used to require complete impartiality, now it allows partiality. Sanctions can be put in place against bad actors in international law. And then last but not least, the crime of aggression. You probably recognize this as a picture of the dock at Nuremberg, the Nazis being tried. What not everyone remembers is that in addition to the Holocaust crimes, one of the key claims, in fact, the legal linchpin of the whole trial, was for the crime of aggression. In Nuremberg, count 1 makes clear this aggressive war and these invasions had been specifically planned in advance in violation of the terms of the Calibri Impact of 1928. That's crucial because the question was, why isn't this just like trying to try the Kaiser after World War I? And the answer is Germany signed the Calibri Impact. And so international law had prohibited war, and yet Germany carried out this war in violation of those obligations, and that was key. So where there had been a license to kill, there was no such thing as a crime of aggression. Now aggression can be a crime. So this is the form of the New World Order. It puts prohibition on force at its core, and then the rest of these rules necessarily follow from it. So let me say a few words about the New World Order, and then I'm going to say more about international agreements in a moment, and then open it up to questions. So you might be thinking, well, what about the UN Charter? And the UN Charter is absolutely crucial. This is actually a document I found in the archives at the Roosevelt Library. It was in the papers of Sumner Welles, who was an Undersecretary of State. And it turns out to be the first draft of what would become the United Nations Charter. And it's drafted by this JTS, James Thomas Shotwell, who happens to have also been the same guy who ghost wrote the Calibri Impact for Briand back in 1928. And he put at its core the same central commitment that was in the Calibri Impact. He put that into what would become the UN Charter. He put it into the very beginning of the UN Charter. And that is the prohibition in Article 2.4 that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. And it has very limited exceptions. Security Council can authorize intervention. There can be self-defense under Article 51, or states can consent to the use of force on their territory. What's not on the list? Violations of international law, violations of treaties. So remember that long list of things that states could go to war for, and one of the ones that they really went to war for on a regular basis under the Old World Order was violations of treaty obligations, but you can't go to war for that anymore. It's a very limited list, and appropriately so, because they want to make the prohibition on war core to the international legal order. The irony is that international law, in effect, makes enforcement of international law hard. And that's one of the fundamental puzzles that has helped motivate my own career in terms of thinking about how to make international law work and why is it so challenging to make it successful. So in the international modern order, international law prohibits states from enforcing international law using force. Now the question is, does that mean international law is not enforced? Is it totally useless? What's the point of international law if you can't enforce it with force? And the answer is that just because you can't use military force to enforce international law doesn't mean that it isn't enforced. It can be enforced through something that I call outcasting, that is denying the benefits of social cooperation and membership. So an example of this is trade sanctions, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And that's not only possible, it's only possible because neutrality no longer requires impartiality. You're allowed to put in place trade sanctions and economic sanctions that under the old system would have been completely illegal. So the idea of outcasting is basically, instead of doing something to you, like invading you, we're going to refuse to do something with you, like trade with you. So you behave badly, I'm just not going to trade with you anymore, as opposed to invading you in return. So an example is the World Trade Organization. There's one of the descriptions of how that works is there's no prospect of incarceration, injunctive relief, damages for harm inflicted, or police enforcement. It has no jailhouse, no bondsmen, no blue helmets, no truncheons or tear gas. What it has is it can simply deny you the benefits, full benefits of membership if you break the rules. You just have countermeasures in exchange. And I can say more about that if anyone wants to ask questions. Okay, so here we come today. Donald Trump was defeated, but he won the presidency on a really fundamentally anti-internationalist platform. And he made good on many of his promises. And from the perspective of an international lawyer, that damage will take significant time to repair. He withdrew from a huge number of international agreements. And I've divided them here into kind of three groups: non-binding arrangements and international organizations, executive agreements, and Article 3 treaties. He withdrew from an unprecedented number of each of these. So non-binding arrangements, like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with the P5 and Iran, that is the so-called Iran nuclear deal, withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council, the Global Compact on Migration, Global Compact on Refugees, the UN Relief and Works Agency. He withdrew from executive agreements, a number of them, including the Paris Agreement famously, and he withdrew from an unprecedented number of Article 2 treaties. These are treaties that require the full advice and consent of the Senate in order to be made. And if folks want to talk about the differences between those categories, I'm happy to get into that if that's a level of detail you all are interested in. Okay, so what's next? So Biden campaigned on this idea of turning it around, right? Of undoing the America First foreign policy and returning the US to the world stage. What does that mean? Well, we're beginning to get a sense of what that means from the personnel he's chosen. He's chosen a lot of people who really believe fundamentally in international agreements, international diplomacy, international order. Many of the people that he's put into these positions are firm believers in international law and international diplomacy. So that's a sign that that's the direction he's likely to go. On the first day in office, he signed an executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement on climate change. He announced that we were not withdrawing from the World Health Organization after all, as Trump had promised. And so we're back in the WHO. And just today, he had a call with Putin, and they agreed to extend the New START treaty for another 5 years, which they are going to have to move on very quickly because that expires in early February if they don't come to agreement. And then if they don't come to an agreement, then it would have to go through the whole Senate process again. So chances are good that they will hopefully be able to figure out a way to extend that for another 5 years. So what else can we expect? So as I said, renewal of New START hopefully will happen in the next couple of weeks. It's been clear that the Biden administration intends to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran and the P5+1. A lot of the people he put in office are people who have been, who were active in creating the JCPOA and who are really committed to returning to that model. He will probably rejoin the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, and the other non-bindings. He can do that on his own. He doesn't need Congress for that. Clearly, there's going to be change in rhetoric, rejection of this idea of America first and an embrace of diplomacy, continued work with the traditional allies, much more support for the EU and NATO, a lot less enthusiasm for Brexit and the idea of cleaving Britain from the rest of Europe. A firm policy against Russian aggression, again, that call with Putin today, Biden made clear he was rejecting Russian interference in Ukraine, for instance, and insisting and rejecting and calling out the fact that Russians were paying bounties on US soldiers in Afghanistan, just to take a couple of examples. There certainly will be a rejuvenation of human rights diplomacy efforts and a lot more emphasis on foreign aid. He's nominated Samantha Power to lead USAID. That's a huge move because she is a very prominent figure, and that has traditionally been a fairly modest agency. So putting her in place in charge of it is a big deal. And he's going to make climate change a much bigger part of his foreign policy. He signaled that by putting John Kerry in charge. Now, how much of this can he do on his own? That's a big question. Some of it he can do on his own. He can rejoin the non-bindings all by himself. He doesn't need any help from Congress for that. But to rejoin the international agreements that are what we could call Article 2 treaties, these require a 2/3 vote in the Senate. That's extremely hard, if not impossible, to get. And so rejoining, for instance, the Open Skies Treaty might be extraordinarily hard, may not happen. We'll have to wait and see. And to take any significant steps on climate change, he's going to need to have Congress on board to do that. And that is going to be difficult, if not impossible, particularly given that they seem not to be willing to press forward with an effort to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, which means that at a minimum, they're going to need 60 votes to move forward. So there's going to be a significant shift. How significant remains to be seen, but certainly a greater emphasis on international agreements as a significant political tool moving forward, an effort to try and put international law at the center and play a much more significant role in international dialogues. We've rejoined, for instance, the COVAX effort to develop a vaccine and distribute the vaccine for the whole world. So there are a number of efforts that have been made. But some of it we will have to wait and see how much Congress is going to be on board for before we can move forward. So the book, again, offers, I think, some reason for hope and a call to action. One of the central arguments of the book is that individual people matter and what people care about matters, and that each generation has to work to understand and move forward the international order. And so one question is going to be if this generation is up to the task, and I'm hopeful, in fact, that it is. And as I teach my students who want to go into international law and want to go into national security and want to go into foreign affairs, and who believe deeply in the power and importance of the global order, I at least am hopeful that the future can be bright. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Yes, Wendy, can you take the first questions from Archie Elam? Can we get his question? Can you bring us over to Archie?
Hello?
Archie, do you want to present your question, or would you like us
Yeah,
to?
go ahead.
Yeah, certainly, I can do that. Your quote on the influence of war, when judicial settlement ends, war begins, sounded to me a lot like von Clausewitz's On War.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there was any influence between the two, or was it just a coincidence?
That's a great question. Yeah, so there was a lot of interplay between the two and between all the philosophers of this period. So I emphasize Hugo Grotius as a kind of central figure in this, but this becomes the central vision that that philosophers of that period and lawyers and political thinkers of the time think. So Clausewitz, of course, famously, war is politics by another name. And so There's a very similar idea animating the vision that Hugo Grotius has. And I think it's easy for us to forget at this point because we've lived, under the UN Charter regime where war has been prohibited. And so we're used to the idea that states just can't use force to get what they want, kind of willy-nilly. And when they do, that's seen as sort of inappropriate, illegal, behaving badly. When Russia uses force or China does, we think of that as sort of bad behavior on part of states. But that was sort of the normal rule of the day for a really, really long time. And you can see that in a variety of writings, including Clausewitz and many others. Yeah, you're right to see that resonance. There's a lot of similarity there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the next question is from Greg. Wendy, can you bring us over to Greg? Greg, do you want to present your question or?
Sure. It's just generally about the nuclear arms limitations framework with Russia and why Trump really dismantled that. I never really had a good understanding. I never found a good analysis, what the strategy or thinking was behind all that, if there was one, and if that is a evolving Republican issue. Is it about a new generation of weaponry? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's a little bit of all of the things that you've mentioned. So there was, at least for a time, a idea that we might develop tactical nuclear weapons, which would have been prohibited by the New START Treaty. Many people were horrified by the idea of tactical nuclear weapons, but there was some enthusiasm about that idea. And so ending New START would open the door to that kind of experimentation and perhaps development of those kinds of weapons. I think there's also part of it is some concern about whether there's complete compliance on the Russian side. Although that is easier to monitor than you might think, because there's a lot of the New START Treaty and all these nuclear treaties come with a lot of inspections. And so it is actually pretty difficult to actually evade the rules. And also a sense that, frankly, a nuclear escalation nuclear escalation to some degree might hurt Russia more than it hurts us because they can't afford it. And so a sort of sense that strategically we may be better off if we're building a lot of these things. I think the problem with that vision is that it also creates incentives for them to pay for it by leaking some of the technology. They're not always great about securing the weapons and ensuring that they don't fall into the wrong hands. And so increased numbers of nuclear warheads in Russia isn't necessarily a good thing for the world if you're worried about loose nuclear weapons. So I think it was not anticipating a lot of that. And then I think also part of it was a kind of generalized suspicion of the idea of international law as a tool for getting things done. And it was a treaty that needed to be renewed. We just thought, no, I don't want to do that. It's like requires some work. And why would I, just generally not a big fan of the idea of international law and international treaties as a tool for developing the best interests of Americans, which I think was wrongheaded. But I think that motivated a lot of the vision of the Trump foreign policy team, John Bolton among them, who's always talked about international law as a violation of US sovereignty. And so was really very much against it. And the time the decision was made not to renew New START, he was the national security advisor. So I think that all of those things kind of played some role in that decision that most observers view as a really tragic choice, because managing that nuclear competition and reducing the number of nuclear warheads is a really key element of managing the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation, or at least that's what experts who work on this tell me.
Thank you.
Yeah, the next question, we have two anonymous questions regarding cyber and how cyber fits into your New World Order framework. So first one is, when does a state-sponsored cyber attack constitute an act of war? And should there be a global standard for determining that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're curious, I've written a long article on that question called "The Law of Cyber Attack," which you might want to Google. But the short answer is basically we apply the same rules to cyber that we apply in the conventional world. So the question that we ask is, we apply what's called the effects test. What effect did the cyber attack have? So did the cyber attack destroy a significant amount of property and kill people? If so, then that is probably an act of war. Now, there has not yet been a cyber attack that seems to have risen to that level, that is killed a number of people and destroyed a lot of property. The closest one that we know of is the Stuxnet attack, which was a cyber attack on Iranian nuclear facility, said to have been planned by the US and Israel, but has not been embraced by either of them or accepted by either of them. But most experts think it was Israel and the US who planned a cyber attack that caused the centrifuges to spin out of control and basically become dysfunctional. But it didn't blow anything up. Nobody got killed. It just caused them to basically break down really fast and made the facility less operational as a result, and cost the Iranians millions and millions and millions of dollars. So there was significant property damage in that sense, but didn't put anybody's life at risk. So there's some debate among experts as to whether that counts as an act of war, whether that rises to level in the technical terms of a use of force under Article 2.4. I'd say the majority of people say not. And no cyber attack that we know of has been the direct cause of a loss of life, although there was a recent attack that may have been a causal factor, forcing someone to use a hospital that was further away and they died in transit. And so some are identifying that as a lethal cyber attack. But a single loss of life, most think is probably not sufficient. So basically the way we analyze it is we say, what is the use of force? What qualifies as a use of force in the normal world? You know, what kind of thing would we think would be sufficient? Usually that's loss of life and significant property damage. And do we meet that standard from the cyber attack? And if the answer is no, then it is not a use of force. The vast majority of cyber attacks are what we call below the threshold, that is below that use of force threshold. And a lot of the hard and interesting thinking now is about what are the rules that apply below that threshold? And the question you asked was kind of, should we have some agreements about what those rules are? And the answer is, yeah, we really should be developing some agreement on what those rules are. There have been some efforts. There's actually 2 efforts underway at the UN right now, one US-led, one Russia-led, sort of competing efforts to develop rules. And part of what's challenging about it is that both of them kind of want to have rules. Both of them kind of don't want to have rules. So both Russia and the US are among the states that are the best at this in the world. And the US tends to be very rule abiding. So if we create a bunch of rules, we're going to follow them. And so a lot of American government officials are a little wary of developing really strong rules in this space because that means we can't do it. And since we follow the rules that we write, we're going to abide by those rules. But is Russia, is China, is Iran, is North Korea? Probably not. And so if you can't actually monitor them effectively, and one of the big problems in cyber is attribution, monitoring them can be quite difficult. And if you don't have any way of actually enforcing those rules, it's not clear you necessarily want really clear rules. So that's the place we're stuck right now in terms of developing a set of rules in this space. I think we'll sort of be slowly moving in the direction of kind of more defined norms. For instance, one place I think we are getting some consensus is that attacks on hospitals are illegal. That seems like a small thing, like it should be kind of obvious, but it wasn't. We're sort of beginning to develop consensus that cyber attacks on hospitals are not allowed because they have this risk of death. And so you might begin by developing some of these sort of not minor, but these sort of narrower norms and kind of build up from there. And so we'll see, but we're a little bit stuck in this kind of catch-22 at the moment, because the states who are in a position to be able to create those rules might be the very ones who are active in this space, and so benefit from there not being really clear rules. So that's the fix we're in at the moment.
Excellent. We have 2 questions on China. So Carl, do you want to go? Wendy, can you take it over to Carl so he can ask the first?
Sure, be happy to. Thank you. Thank you, Oona. Many of the rules in international institutions were really developed when the US was, for the sake of argument, more of a unipolar power and a hegemon, and yet power is shifting in the world today, and a lot of those rules may not be applicable going forward. How do you think about the revisions that are necessary and the ability to pass those revisions given voting within many of those institutions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the irony of China, of course, is we insisted on their seat on the Security Council. So when the Security Council was being created, it was the United States was like, China must be included. Because at the time we thought of the Chinese representatives as the government of Chiang Kai-shek, which we didn't fully realize had basically completely lost control of the continent and was not really in a position to govern. And so the Chinese representative at the time, who went by the name Wellington Koo, was like much loved by the diplomatic corps, and they thought, we really want the Chinese on the Security Council, and insisted on China being included. And so China, of course, does have a vote on the Security Council, which is the most important institution. But a lot of these other institutions, it has a much less central formal role and wants more of a role. And I think is beginning to play more of a role. So the WHO, I think we all now have heard, it plays a big role at the WHO. It was one of the reasons for a lot of critique of the WHO, because some argue that some of the soft pedaling the WHO seemed to do in the early days of the pandemic may have been in part because so much of their funding comes from China, and a concern that that may have motivated the WHO kind of slowness to respond. WHO, of course, very much rejects that idea and says that they were being cautious for all the right reasons. But so yeah, China clearly sees playing a bigger role in these institutions as central to its long-term best interests. And it is gradually strengthening its diplomatic game in a whole wide range of spaces. And what was really frustrating during the Trump administration, I think, and has been true of previous administrations as well, is that we are in a position, as you rightly described, of sort of almost this hegemonic role. We play a leading role in almost all these major international institutions. And China recognized that as a source of strength and is trying to get there. And we couldn't recognize it as a source of strength to hold on to it.
Right.
Right. So we're like, I'm out of here on the WHO, instead of like, let's stay in the WHO and make it better. Like, let's reform its institutions. Let's find ways to make it better. Instead, it was like, we're just going to drop out of the WHO instead of trying to really play the role that we should play of trying to improve these institutions. If they're failures, figure out why they're failures and try to strengthen them. So I'm hoping that part of the lesson learned in the last few years is that as our relative strength in the global economy and in relative military strength declines, just by virtue of the fact that everybody else is growing and we're not going to be able to stop that, that our leading role in these international institutions is a source of major strength. And we should recognize like how lucky we are to have that role and build on it and strengthen it. And if institutions aren't working the way we want them to work, like try to make them work better, but don't give up on them, and make sure that they reflect our values, continue to reflect our values instead of pulling out of them. Another example is the Human Rights Council. So it has been doing things that understandably, rightly frustrate Americans, including like letting members be on the Human Rights Council who are clear human rights abusers. And so the response is like, let's drop out of this thing, instead of like, let's try to fix this institution and make it actually reflect what it's supposed to, which is be a real voice for human rights in the world. And it's that impulse to run away rather than try to fix institutions that I think is really damaging. Meanwhile, the Chinese are very smart. They know whenever we jump out, they jump in, and they play a role in kind of shaping those institutions to fit their values. And sometimes those are not consistent with ours. And that's something I think, hopefully, we will do a better job of sort of recognizing the strength and power that comes from playing a significant role in helping to shape the rules of the global order and the kind of unique position we're in right now. That is not always going to be the position the US is in. So we ought to seize the day and do as much as we can to shape those institutions for the long term. That's my view, at least.
Yeah, Richard had a related question on China, but it has to do specifically with Taiwan. Richard, do you want to go over?
Sure. Can you hear me? I'm calling from Hong Kong in the.
We can hear you clear, Richard.
Okay, so what are the fundamental? Oh, great. What are the fundamental international legal issues that apply to claim over Taiwan? And how does international law interplay with Chinese domestic law on the matter?
I think I caught most of that. So yeah, it's incredibly challenging, right? So Taiwan lives in this kind of nether space of not being fully recognized as an independent legal entity by the United States. Formerly, we used to have a treaty, that mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. President Carter was the one who actually withdrew that in order to normalize relations, open the door to normalizing relations with China, because it's a no-go for China to have normalized relations with Taiwan. We basically kind of have to choose. Nonetheless, the US has continued to effectively provide a defensive shield for Taiwan, and sort of made it clear that any effort to sort of take over Taiwan was going to be met with US defensive force. I frankly, during the transition, was fearful that that there could be a move on Taiwan, and a lot of China experts that I know were worried about that, given that it seemed that Trump administration might not respond. And so it seemed like a moment of real vulnerability. I think a lot of people breathed a huge sigh of relief when we got through to the inauguration without an attack. It's a complicated matter because we don't formally recognize its sovereignty. So formally, it's not clear that it's an obvious violation of Article 2.4, but we also don't recognize it as formally a part of China. And so we've sort of let it live in this sort of legal gray space. And everyone sort of agreed to disagree, and kind of let it remain in that legal gray space. And that's allowed the US and China to continue to carry on relations, even though they don't agree about the future of Taiwan. And I think we're probably going to go back to something clearer. I mean, we haven't really reversed that, but I think that's going to continue to be the policy for a while. How tenable is that in the long term? I don't know. It's worked pretty well for several decades, so probably will continue to work well for a while, but it remains a real source of instability and uncertainty and danger in the region. It's not the only place that's a source of danger in the region. If you look at the South China Sea more generally, there's a huge number of islands, reefs, rocks that China has laid claim to in the South China Sea. And they're overlapping claims between China and many other neighbors. Some of those rocks, reefs, islands are claimed by 4 or 5 other countries at the same time, but China has basically, by force of will and force of force, turned a number of these reefs into military bases and laid claim to them. And that's another real source of friction in the region. And the US has responded to that generally by refusing to accept those conquests, because that's effectively what they are, and continue to do overflight and pass-bys and the like. But that's another thing that eventually is going to come to a head. And that's another source of real friction between the US and China, and between China and its neighbors, as we try to work out kind of how these two big hegemons are going to get along in this new world, in a new world in which China is building a really big navy, by the way. So for a long time, we were sort of very dominant around the world and managing to maintain dominance on the high seas and all around the world. And China's in a position now to increasingly match us, at least in the region. And so that increases, again, vulnerability for lots of folks in the region, as well as for US assets and allies. So that's going to continue to be a real source of concern, and one I'm sure this administration is thinking deeply about.
Mr. Hathaway, a question. Not so long ago, you worked at the DoD. My understanding is you were the #2 lawyer there. What continues to keep you and your colleagues up at night from a DoD perspective? And what advice would you give to the new president as he starts his new term?
I think what really keeps me up at night is that these rules of the system that had been pretty well accepted for a long time have been eroding. When Russia seized Crimea in the first successful conquest in Europe since World War II, that was a very dangerous precedent to set. When China again seizes this territory in South China Sea, these are really destabilizing and open the door to increased conflict and friction around the world. And if we can't count on those rules to be followed by everybody, then it opens the door to a lot more conflict around the world. And so that worries me a lot, and I think it worried my colleagues a great deal. And are we going to be able to come to a place where we have a little bit sort of more clarity about those rules and agreement that these rules continue to stick and that everyone needs to abide by them? Or is Russia going to keep pushing the envelope? Is it going to keep meddling in Eastern Ukraine? Is it going to do the same in parts of Georgia? Is it going to threaten some of the Baltic states, which continue to be really fragile and I think, very much subject to potential aggression from the Russians? So how are we going to manage those points of friction in a world where these are the formal rules, you can't use military force, but increasingly states are kind of breaking those rules and getting away with it. And that I think is a source of real danger. So that at least is one of the issues that I worry a great deal about.
Professor Hathaway, we are at the end of we're right at 6:30, so we want to be sensitive to your time. Do we want to call it, do you want to take one more question, or have you had enough for
I'm always happy to take a final question if you have one you want to point
okay, so
to.
we'll take a final question. Both questions I think relate to China, so China is top of mind here with this group. Yeah. So I'd like to take, if we could sort of combine, I think Bill and Jean's question together. I think they're both somewhat interconnected. Bill's question is, can China's force gradually undercut our concept of rule of law? And Jean is relative to Taiwan. I prefer Jean to ask that question because that's a little more complicated. So Jean, do you want to sort of take that question and sort of elaborate on that a little bit so we can get a final answer on that?
Sure, now that I can unmute myself. Professor, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Relative to Taiwan, I believe we have an understanding with Taiwan that if it is attacked, we will come to its defense. I'm not sure if this is a treaty, so that is one question. And two, does it bear legal standing in the world of international law?
Yeah, so you're right that there's been this kind of long-standing understanding, but it's not a legally enforceable treaty. It's not, in fact, we specifically withdrew, as I mentioned, from the Mutual Defense Treaty that we had with Taiwan in order to normalize relations with China. So we don't have a formal legal obligation. For instance, we do with other states. So we have a mutual defense treaty with Japan, where we basically agree if they're attacked, we definitely will come to their defense. We have a treaty obligation to do so. We don't have anything formal with Taiwan, and it was a source of real anxiety for many because as our commitment to our informal norms seemed to be at risk in the last few years, there was a question as to how committed the administration was to that informal norm too, because there wasn't a treaty obligation that said you have to come to Taiwan's defense. it was just this sort of longstanding understanding, but a lot of longstanding understandings were being called into question. And so it was less clear that the response would have been what we all would have assumed it would be. Can you remind me of the first question, Frank? And is it on the list?
The first question. Yeah, it's can China's force of will gradually undercut our concept of rule of law?
Yeah, I mean, the real question I think is going to be, what does China decide it wants to do? So I think it has played a kind of spoiler role in the last couple of decades, not entirely, but it has often been content to play a bit of the spoiler role. So when we sanction, say, Sudan, because they're engaging in massive human rights violations, including genocide, China comes in and buys up the oil, you know, at a much cheaper price because they can't sell it anywhere else, but they can sell it to the Chinese, and the Chinese therefore undercut the effect of the sanctions. And they've been doing that all around the world. We sanctioned Russia for the invasion of Crimea. China comes in and buys the oil from Russia at a significantly discounted price, therefore, again, undermining the value of the sanctions and undermining the rule of law, because these sanctions were meant to enforce the rule of law, that is a prohibition on genocide and the prohibition on conquest, and sanctions is the main tool that we have to enforce those rules. So China's played kind of this spoiler role in this sense. And I think the question of China's coming of age here is, does it start to see that it actually has an interest in maintaining the system, not upsetting the system? Does it see that it now, as a rising power in the world that can shape the direction of these institutions, does it have an increasing interest in actually encouraging states to abide by the rules? And what role is it going to play going forward? Is it going to try to create these rules, shape them, and then enforce them? What does that look like? I think there's a real question about that. Or is it going to continue to play this sort of spoiler role that really is the role for a small state on the outside, or a state that's sort of being excluded from institutions, not really the role of a big player that's helping to shape those institutions? So the hopeful part of me thinks maybe they will play a productive role, although the question then becomes, what direction do they shape these institutions? What kind of values do they have them reflect? And are we going to be happy with that direction? But you know, are they going to continue to undermine the rules that we try to support and encourage around the world? Or are they going to be willing to kind of play a more productive role in the creation of that international set of international institutions? And can we find at least some places where we can have some agreement and kind of build from that area of collaboration and cooperation? I think that's probably the kind of most hopeful step forward, is finding where those areas are that we have shared interests and how do we build from there. But we'll see. I'm hopeful, though. I like to be hopeful, but cautiously so, as we move forward and kind of see the direction that all these very challenging issues take.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, something hopeful. We all need a bit of that. I want to thank Professor Hathaway and Tom Krantz and Frank Bria for bringing this program together for us. Our next speaker event is on Tuesday, February 16th at 12 noon. We'll be hosting Greg Medcraft of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank each of you for joining us tonight, again, for your support. As always, please share any feedback you have on our program with me at info@worldaffairsforum.org. I look forward to continued engagement and seeing your faces and building the engagement back into our virtual programming. I really appreciate all of your participation tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Good to talk
you.
with you all.